Welcome to Wickless Night. There is something different about a night with no light at all, no candle burning, no lamp in the corner, just darkness, silence, and the feeling that something may be closer than it should be. Tonight's stories come from people who lived through moments they still cannot explain. A sound in an empty room, a stranger at the door, a shadow that moved when no one else was there. Before we step into the dark, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy slow, unsettling, true horror stories, subscribe to Wickless Night. Get comfortable. The lights are already gone. When I was around 8 years old, my parents started letting my neighbor friend and me explore the woods and open land behind our neighborhood. It was a different time, before parents tracked every step their kids took, or expected them to be indoors the moment school was over. Our parents still had rules, of course. We were not allowed to go anywhere near the road by ourselves. We were not allowed to talk to strangers, and we were absolutely not supposed to cross the river. The river was the main rule. It curved around the area in a big horseshoe-shaped bend, creating a natural boundary around the woods, ponds, trails, and brush where we spent most of our time. From above, it probably looked like the river had wrapped itself around that stretch of land. To us, it was like being given our own little wilderness. As long as we stayed on our side of the river, we were allowed to roam. That felt like complete freedom. The area behind the neighborhood was not deep wilderness, exactly. You could still hear distant traffic in some places. You could still see the backs of houses if you climbed the right hill or found an opening in the trees. But when you were 8 years old, it felt huge. There were paths through the woods, some made by animals and some made by kids over the years. There were places where the ground dipped down toward the river. There were muddy edges around a pond. There were fallen trees we climbed over, clusters of brush we avoided because they were full of thorns, and little clearings that felt like they belonged only to us. My friend and I spent countless afternoons out there. We would leave after school or on weekends, tell our parents we were going to explore, and disappear into the trees for hours. Sometimes we brought snacks. Sometimes we brought cheap flashlights, even though we were supposed to be home before dark. Sometimes we took sticks and pretended they were swords, rifles, or whatever else we thought made us look like adventurers. Like most kids, we turned the woods into something bigger than they really were. We invented stories. There was a werewolf that lived near the farthest part of the river bend. It was huge, taller than a man, and it only came out when the sun started going down. We said it had yellow eyes and black fur, even though neither of us had ever seen anything like it. Then there was the Killer Man. He was supposed to live somewhere deeper in the trees, near the pond or maybe beyond it. Depending on the day, he lived in an old shack, a cave, an abandoned camp, or a hole in the ground. His appearance changed constantly, because we never agreed on the details. Sometimes he wore a mask. Sometimes he carried a knife. Sometimes he had a rifle. Sometimes he was just a tall man in old clothes who watched kids from behind trees. The stories were never meant to be real. They were just the kind of things kids say when they have a big open area to explore and enough imagination to turn every strange sound into part of an adventure. One day we would be hunting the werewolf. The next day we would be running from the Killer Man. We would hide behind trees, whisper to each other, and dare one another to go farther down a trail. We would see a broken branch and decide it had been snapped by the Killer Man. We would find animal tracks in the mud and say they belonged to the werewolf. It was fun because we knew, deep down, that it was made up. Or at least we thought we knew. By the time I was 11, we had been exploring that area for years. We knew most of the trails, We knew which parts became muddy after rain. We knew where the pond was, where the river curved closest to the trees, and where the brush was too thick to get through without getting scratched up. We also knew how to get home quickly if we thought we heard someone calling us. That spring, something happened that made our old made-up stories feel less made up than they ever had before. It was a weekend, and I remember the weather being nice. The long gray winter had finally passed, and spring was starting to show everywhere. The ground was still soft in places. The trees were filling in with leaves. The pond had that greenish look ponds get in early spring, and the woods smelled like wet dirt, old leaves, and things beginning to grow again. My friend and I went out exploring like we always did. We were heading through one of the more familiar parts of the woods, not too far from the pond, when we came across a campsite. It was not a campsite we had seen before. There were 4 people there. They had tents set up in a small clearing. There was a fire going, though it was not huge. They were sitting around it, drinking beer and talking. It was getting closer to sunset, but there was still plenty of daylight. They looked like ordinary campers, or at least ordinary adults spending a weekend outside. We did not get close to them. We stayed on the edge of the clearing and waved as we passed. A couple of them waved back. None of them seemed angry that we were there. None of them told us to leave. They were just sitting around their fire, doing what campers do. Talking, drinking, probably enjoying the warmer weather. We kept walking. I remember thinking it was a little strange that they had set up camp there, because it was not really a campground. It was just the woods behind our neighborhood, but it was a big area, and we had seen people fishing at the pond or walking dogs back there before. So, I did not think too much about it. We went home before dark. The next day, we went back. At first, we were not even planning to check on the campsite. We were just out exploring again. But eventually, our path brought us close to the clearing, and we both got curious. We wanted to see whether the campers were still there. Maybe they had slept outside overnight. Maybe they would still be sitting around the fire. Maybe they had packed up and moved on. What we found was not what we expected. The campsite looked destroyed. The tents were trampled, not neatly taken down, not folded or packed. They were crushed into the dirt and flattened in places, like someone had stepped all over them or dragged them around. Trash was everywhere. Beer cans, wrappers, pieces of food packaging, random clothing, and other belongings had been tossed around the clearing. Some things were near the tents, some were spread out farther into the brush. It did not look like people had simply packed up badly and left. It looked like someone had gone through everything. The fire had burned down to ashes, but some of the ashes were still smoldering. Tiny red spots glowed beneath gray ash when the wind moved through the clearing. That was the part that made the timing feel strange. The campers had been there the evening before. The fire was not completely dead. Their things were still there, but the people were gone. All 4 of them. There were no voices, no movement in the tents, no one walking back from the pond, no cars nearby, no sign that they had packed up and left on purpose. My friend and I stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment, trying to understand what we were looking at. At 11, we were old enough to know something was off, but we were still kids, so our minds went straight to the worst possible explanation. The killer man. We had made him up years earlier, but the campsite made him feel real. I remember my friend looking at the crushed tents and saying something like, "What happened here?" I did not have an answer. I remember looking around the tree line, suddenly convinced that someone could be standing behind any one of the trees, watching us. We did not go deeper into the clearing. We did not search through the tents. We did not touch anything. We decided we needed to tell our parents. That part was not even a question. A group of adults had been camping there the day before. Now their tents and belongings were destroyed, their fire was still warm enough to have embers, and they were nowhere to be found. We turned around and started heading home. At first, we walked quickly. Then we saw him. He was sitting on a low tree branch near the pond. The pond was not far from the campsite, but far enough that we could not see the clearing from where he was. He looked like he had been there for a while. He was dressed in old, worn-out clothes. Nothing about him looked clean or neat. His jacket or shirt looked faded. His pants looked dirty. And he had the general appearance of someone who had been living outside or had not cared much about how he looked in a long time. He was fishing, but he did not have a pole. He did not have a tackle box. He did not have a bucket or chair or cooler. He had only a piece of fishing line and a hook. Maybe there was a stick involved, or maybe he was holding the line in his hands. I do not remember perfectly. What I remember is that it looked wrong. Not impossible, just wrong. He was sitting on that branch over the edge of the pond, fishing with almost nothing, as though he had been dropped there from another time. My friend and I slowed down. The man looked at us. He did not wave. He did not speak. He did not ask us what we were doing. He just gave us a look. I cannot explain exactly what made the look so frightening. Maybe it was because we were already scared from the campsite. Maybe we had been talking about telling our parents, and suddenly seeing an unfamiliar adult alone in the woods made us panic. But he looked at us in a way that made both of us feel like we should leave immediately. His eyes did not seem friendly. He had the kind of blank expression that can feel worse than anger. He did not smile. He did not frown. He just watched us. The old clothes, the strange fishing line, the pond, the ruined campsite, and our years of pretending there was a killer man in the woods all came together in one moment. We thought he was the killer man. We thought he had done something to the campers. We thought he had destroyed their tents, gotten rid of them somehow. And now he was sitting near the pond as if nothing had happened. And we thought he might be coming for us next. We ran. There was no discussion. We did not call out. We did not ask him anything. We turned and started running as fast as we could through the woods. I remember branches hitting my arms. I remember trying not to trip over roots. I remember my friend running beside me, and both of us breathing too hard to talk. Every sound behind us made me think the man was following. I kept expecting to hear footsteps. I kept expecting him to call after us. I kept expecting to look back and see him moving through the trees. But I did not look back. I was too scared. We ran until we were far enough away that we felt like we could stop. Then we kept walking fast. The whole way home, we kept talking over each other. He was there. Did you see the tents? Why was he fishing like that? Where did the campers go? Do you think he did something to them? By the time we got back to our neighborhood, the story had already grown in our minds. The campsite was not just abandoned anymore. It had been attacked. The campers were not just gone. They had been taken. The man by the pond was not just strange. He was the killer man we had been pretending existed since we were 8. We told our parents, or at least we tried to. We explained that we had found a campsite in the woods, that there had been people there the day before, and now their tents were destroyed and their stuff was everywhere. We told them about the man at the pond. We told them he looked creepy. We told them he had old clothes and no fishing pole. We told them he just stared at us. Our parents listened, but they did not react the way we hoped they would. They did not call the police right away. They did not grab flashlights and march into the woods. They did not say there was a killer hiding near the pond. They treated it like we were two kids who had found some people's messy campsite and scared ourselves with stories. Maybe they were right. Maybe they assumed the campers had been drinking, arguing, and making a mess. Maybe they had packed up in a hurry and left their trash behind. Maybe they had broken down the tents badly because they were drunk or careless. Maybe the man fishing was just another person who spent time around the pond. But to us, it did not feel that simple. The campers had waved at us the day before. They looked normal. Their tents had been upright. Their belongings had been together. The fire had been going. Then, less than 24 hours later, the campsite looked torn apart. For the rest of the spring, their things stayed there. That was what made it harder to forget. Every time my friend and I went near that part of the woods, we could still see pieces of the campsite. The crushed tents slowly flattened into the dirt. The clothing faded and got wet. The trash blew into the brush. The fire pit became a dark patch of ash and burned wood. Nobody came back to clean it up. Nobody came back looking for their belongings. No one ever seemed to come searching for the campers. At first, we would stand far away and look at the clearing. We never wanted to go close again. The abandoned things made the place feel cursed. A shirt caught on a branch looked like someone standing there. A crushed tent in the distance looked like a body. Empty cans scattered around the fire pit looked like evidence of something horrible. But the longer the stuff stayed, the more confused we became. If the campers had left voluntarily, why had they not come back for their belongings? If they had been in trouble, why had nobody searched the woods? If something bad had happened, why had it not been on the news? We asked our parents again. They checked. At least, they told us they had checked local news and had not seen anything about 4 missing campers. There were no stories about a group disappearing near the river. There were no reports about a dangerous man hiding in the woods behind our neighborhood. There was nothing. That made the whole thing feel even stranger. As kids, we expected an answer. We expected adults to tell us something. Maybe the campers were found. Maybe the police had come. Maybe the man was known to live nearby. Maybe there was a logical reason for everything. But there was no answer. Our parents said it was probably just a group of people who got drunk, made a mess, and left without bothering to clean up after themselves. That was probably the truth. It made sense. They had been drinking beer around a fire. Maybe they had gotten into an argument. Maybe they had decided to leave suddenly. Maybe they had wrecked their own tents while packing up. Maybe the campsite looked more destroyed to us because we were kids and had already decided something terrible had happened. The man fishing could have been completely unrelated. Maybe he was homeless. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was just an old fisherman who had found a quiet place to spend the day. Maybe his strange clothes and silent stare only seemed threatening because we were already scared. All of that makes sense. But even now, there is a part of me that wonders. I wonder why the campsite was still there for so long. I wonder why no one came back for anything. I wonder why the fire still had embers. I wonder whether the man at the pond had seen something. I wonder whether he had been watching us because he knew we had found the campsite. And I wonder whether the stories my friend and I made up when we were 8 had come from more than imagination. That sounds ridiculous when I say it now. Kids make up werewolves and killer men because kids like scary stories. We turn trees into monsters and strange adults into villains. We see danger in places where adults see nothing but mud, trash, and old fishing spots. But sometimes imagination works in strange ways. Sometimes it takes a real thing, a stranger, an abandoned camp, a dark trail, and gives it a shape before you understand what you are looking at. Maybe our killer man was never real. Maybe he was only a name we gave to every uncomfortable feeling we had in those woods. Maybe the fisherman was not dangerous. Maybe the campers were irresponsible. Maybe nothing bad happened at all. Still, I can remember the sight of that destroyed campsite as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The trampled tents, the clothes in the dirt, the trash scattered through the clearing, the ashes still glowing faintly beneath the gray. Then the man sitting on the branch by the pond, holding only a hook and line, staring at us without saying a word. For a long time after that, my friend and I stopped playing the Killer Man game. We still explored the woods sometimes, but we did not pretend we were being chased anymore. We did not need to. For the rest of that spring, the woods felt different. Not like a place where we invented monsters, like a place where something had happened, and we were too young to understand it. I still do not know what happened to those 4 campers. I do not know if they really left in a drunken mess, if they fought, if they were careless, or if they simply never cared enough to come back and clean up. I do not know who the fisherman was. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he was just poor, strange, and uncomfortable around 2 scared kids staring at him. Or maybe he was exactly the kind of person we had spent years pretending lived out there. I will probably never know. But I still wonder whether our imaginations were only pretending to reveal the truth, or whether, for one strange spring weekend, they actually did. When I was about 16, I used to go to a summer youth scheme on my estate. It was one of those local programs meant to keep teenagers busy during the school holidays. We would meet up with youth workers, hang around the community center, play football, mess about, do small activities, and sometimes get taken on trips if there was funding for it. Most of the time, it was nothing special. But when you are 16 and live on an estate where there is not always much to do, even a simple trip somewhere different can feel like a big event. The youth workers would take us to caravan parks, outdoor activity places, camping trips, or somewhere we could spend a day away from home. We went to Haggerston Castle Caravan Park a few times. We did camping. We went to places with lakes, woods, ropes courses, and activity fields. There was always a mixture of people on the trips. Kids who were genuinely excited, kids who acted like they were too cool to enjoy anything, people who only came because their friends came, and a few who spent the entire journey complaining. I was somewhere in the middle. I liked getting out. I liked being away from the estate for a while. Even when the trips were basic, it felt good to see somewhere different. One summer, they took us up to Kielder Forest, near the reservoir. I remember being excited about the trip because Kielder sounded properly remote. It was not just a caravan park or an activity center near a town. It was forest. Real forest. The kind of place where the roads got quieter the farther you went, where the trees became thicker, and where you could look around and feel like there was nothing nearby for miles. The journey up there took a while. We were packed into a minibus or coach, talking too loudly at first, passing snacks around, messing about, and listening to whatever music someone had playing through a phone or a cheap speaker. The youth workers kept telling people to settle down. Someone probably got warned for throwing something. Someone else probably kept asking how much longer it would take, but eventually the noise died down. As the roads narrowed and the scenery changed, people started looking out the windows more. The trees seemed to go on forever. The landscape had a different feel from where we lived. There were wide stretches of dark green forest, long roads, open patches of land, and a sense of distance that you do not get in built-up places. Even during the day, it felt isolated. Kielder Reservoir was beautiful. I remember the water looking huge and cold, surrounded by hills and forest. The sky seemed wider there too. There were fewer lights, fewer houses, fewer signs of ordinary life. At night, you could see the stars properly. That was something I noticed right away. Back home, The sky always had a glow to it from streetlights, houses, traffic, and everything else. You could see a few stars on a clear night, but never that many. Up there, the darkness was deeper, and the stars looked sharper. That should have made the place feel peaceful. In some ways it did, but it also made it feel like the kind of place where you could easily get lost. We were staying somewhere nearby, maybe a campsite or group accommodation. I do not remember every detail of where we slept, but I remember the feeling of being surrounded by trees. There was forest in every direction. Even when there were lights from the camp area or the building we were using, you always knew that beyond those lights was darkness. During the day, we did normal group activities. There may have been walks, outdoor games, maybe something around the water. We hung around in groups, joked with each other, complained about food, and tried to act braver than we felt. Nothing particularly strange happened during the day. The weird thing happened at night. One of the youth workers announced that we were going on a midnight walk through the forest. That immediately got everyone talking. Some people thought it sounded brilliant. Some thought it was stupid. A few people said they were not going. Others acted nervous, but still joined because they did not want to look scared in front of their friends. I went. At 16, you do things like that. You do not necessarily want to be out in a pitch-black forest at midnight, but you also do not want to be the one who stays behind while everyone else goes. The sky that night was clear. There were no clouds. There was no rain. No mist low enough to hide the ground. The stars were everywhere, bright enough that the sky looked almost crowded with them. But once we got under the trees, they did not help much. The forest was dark, not ordinary dark. Not like walking down a quiet street where you can still see houses, lamps, car lights, and windows. This was the kind of darkness that seemed to absorb everything. The trees blocked out most of the sky, and the path ahead disappeared beyond the reach of the one torch we had. Only one person had a proper torch. One of the youth workers walked at the front of the group with it. The light shook as they walked, swinging across the trail, tree trunks, roots, and patches of grass. Everyone else followed behind. Some people had phone screens, but phones back then were not as useful as they are now. Even if someone had a small light, it did not reach very far. Most of us were depending on the torch at the front and the person in front of us not suddenly stopping. We walked in a loose line. The youth worker with the torch kept telling everyone to stay together. Do not wander off. Watch your footing. Do not start messing around. Stay on the trail. The usual instructions. But every time the torch beam moved away from one part of the forest, the darkness rushed back into it. You would see a tree for half a second, then it would disappear again. You would see branches overhead, then nothing. Sometimes a stump or rock would appear at the edge of the light and look like a person standing off the path until the torch moved again. People were trying to keep the mood light. Someone made a joke about Blair Witch. Someone else said they had heard wolves lived nearby, even though that was probably nonsense. Another person said they heard something moving in the trees, and everybody told them to shut up. There was laughter, but it was nervous laughter. I remember feeling more aware of the sounds than anything else. The crunch of boots on the path, the wind moving lightly through the tops of the trees, the soft snap of a branch somewhere off to the side, the sound of people breathing harder as we walked uphill, the occasional whispered conversation from people behind me. The forest had its own sounds too, but they were difficult to place. A bird shifting somewhere above us, something small rustling through leaves, distant water, maybe from the reservoir or a stream. At some point, the group was walking down a trail that curved through a denser part of the woods. The torchlight reached ahead in a narrow beam, showing the dirt path and the lower parts of tree trunks. The rest of the forest stood around us in black layers. I was not at the very front, I was somewhere in the middle of the group, close enough to see the torch beam but far enough back that it was not lighting my surroundings clearly all the time. Then I saw it. It was off the trail to one side. At first I thought it was someone from our group who had stepped away. Maybe someone had gone behind a tree. Maybe someone was trying to scare us. Maybe one of the youth workers had moved ahead and was standing at the edge of the path. But it was not moving like a person. It was glowing, not brightly enough to light up the trees around it, but bright enough that I could see it clearly against the darkness. A white figure. Brilliant, pale white. It looked almost like it had its own light. The figure was dressed in old clothing. That was the first detail my brain noticed after the glow. The clothes did not look modern. They looked old-fashioned, like something from a historical film or a costume drama. There was a shirt or garment with one of those old ruffled collars around the neck, the kind people wore centuries ago. A white neck ruffle or something like that. Then I realized it had no head. There was no face, no hair, no head at all. The body was there, upright and human-shaped, dressed in old clothing, glowing in the dark. But above the ruffled collar, there was nothing, just empty darkness. I stopped walking. Everything in me went cold. For a second, I could not even react properly. My mind was trying to understand what I was seeing. I remember thinking that it had to be a trick of the light, a tree trunk, a piece of clothing caught on a branch. Something reflected from the torch, but the shape was too clear. It was standing there, a headless man in old clothes, glowing white in the forest. I stared at it. Then it vanished. Not by walking away, not by moving behind a tree, not by fading into the distance. It was simply there 1 second and gone the next. I blinked hard. I looked again. Nothing, only darkness between the trees. The torchlight swung forward and briefly hit part of the area where I had seen it, but there was no person there. No reflective sign, no white cloth, no stump, no costume. Nothing. The trail kept moving. The people around me kept walking. Nobody screamed. Nobody asked what had happened. Nobody else seemed to have seen anything. For a few seconds, I wondered if I had imagined it. I almost said something, but I did not. I was 16. The last thing I wanted was for everyone to laugh at me or tell me I had seen a branch. I did not want the youth workers to think I was trying to cause trouble. I did not want to be the person who stopped a midnight walk to announce that I had seen a headless ghost in the woods. So I kept walking, but I could not stop looking toward the trees. Every time the torch moved, I expected to see the figure again. Every pale trunk looked wrong. Every patch of moonlight between branches made me tense. Every time I heard someone behind me step on a twig, I thought it was coming closer. I remember feeling completely separated from the rest of the group, even though I was surrounded by people. They were talking. They were joking. They were complaining about the walk. And I was trying to act normal while replaying the image in my head. The glowing white clothes, the old ruff around the neck, the empty space where the head should have been. The figure had only appeared for a second or two, maybe less, but it felt like much longer. By the time we got back to where we were staying, I had mostly convinced myself not to talk about it. I told myself I was tired. I told myself the torchlight had caught a strange shape at the exact wrong angle. I told myself my mind had turned a tree, mist, or reflective surface into a person because we were walking through a dark forest at midnight. That was the rational answer. And I wanted the rational answer. I did not tell the others, at least not right away. I may have mentioned it later to someone I trusted, but I do not remember anyone else saying they had seen the same thing that night. As far as I knew, I was the only person in the group who saw it. For years, it stayed as one of those strange memories you carry without doing much with. I did not become obsessed with it. I did not go searching for ghosts every weekend. I did not start believing every old forest had something supernatural in it. I just remembered it. Sometimes, when someone mentioned Kielder Forest, the image would come back. Sometimes when I saw a historical costume in a film, I would remember that ruffled collar. Sometimes, walking through a dark wooded area would make me think about the figure standing off the path, glowing white and headless. But I did not have any explanation. Then, about 5 years ago, I was looking online. I do not remember exactly what made me search. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I had seen a post about haunted places in Northumberland. Maybe I had been watching something about Kielder Forest and remembered the midnight walk. Whatever the reason, I started looking for stories connected to the area. I found an obscure paranormal forum. It was not a major website. It was one of those old forums where people posted long stories, blurry photos, local legends, and arguments about whether anything was real. Some posts were obviously exaggerated. Some were vague. Some sounded like people repeating stories they had heard from relatives. I was not expecting to find anything useful. Then I found references to a cottage near the area where we had been walking. The cottage was linked, according to posts I read, to the English Civil War. I do not know how accurate the historical details were. The forum may have been repeating local legends. People online can connect almost any old building to a battle, execution, secret tunnel, cursed soldier, or tragic death if enough time has passed. But the descriptions caught my attention. There were people saying they had seen a figure in old clothing in the same general area. Some said it was a man. Some said he wore clothing from the Civil War era. Some said he had a pale glow around him. And some described a headless figure. That was the moment I felt a chill, because I had never gone looking for that exact story before. I had not spent years telling people I saw a Civil War ghost. I had not known there was supposedly a cottage nearby with any history attached to it. At 16, I had not been thinking about old wars, historical clothing, or local hauntings. I had only seen something in the forest, something glowing white, something wearing old clothes, something with a ruffled collar, something with no head. And years later, I found people online describing what sounded very similar in the same area. That does not prove anything. I know that. Paranormal forums are full of stories. People can influence one another. Once one person posts about a headless figure near an old cottage, other people may start interpreting shadows and strange lights through that story. Memories can shift over time, too. It is possible that I remembered the figure as more historical because I later read about the cottage. I have thought about that. It is possible that the story online changed the way I framed the memory. Maybe what I saw was a pale tree trunk, and the torch beam made it look like a person. Maybe the collar was a branch. Maybe the missing head was simply darkness above a lighter shape. Maybe the figure vanished because the torch moved, changing the angle of the light. That would be a perfectly reasonable explanation. But the problem is that I remember seeing it before I knew anything about the cottage. I remember how it looked. I remember the old clothing. I remember the neck ruffle. I remember the blank space above it. And I remember feeling that it was not a tree. It was not just some vague shadow. It was a human-shaped figure standing off the trail. One of the things that has always bothered me most is how visible it was. The forest was pitch black, apart from one torch. We were not walking through fog or bright moonlight. There was no light source near the figure. Yet it seemed brighter than the trees around it. It did not glow like a lamp. It was more like it was pale enough to be seen in darkness, where nothing else should have been visible. That is hard to explain. The youth worker's torch never pointed directly at it when I first saw it. The beam was farther ahead on the path, If it had been a person wearing white clothes, the torchlight might have caught it, but it did not seem like that. It was off to the side, where the forest should have been almost entirely black. And then it vanished immediately. Not slowly, not in a way that gave me time to understand what I was seeing. It was just gone. When I think about it now, I often wonder what would have happened if I had shouted. What if I had called the others over? Would they have seen it too? Would the torch have revealed a tree or a marker or some piece of fabric that explained everything? Would the figure have vanished before anyone reached it? I will never know. At the time, I stayed quiet because I did not want to look stupid. Now, part of me wishes I had said something. Maybe I would have had another person confirm what I saw. Maybe I would have had proof it was a normal object. Either way, I might have some kind of answer. Instead, I have only the memory, and the forum posts years later. I do not know whether there really is a cottage near where we walked that has a genuine connection to the English Civil War. I do not know whether people have actually seen the same thing, or whether they have repeated the same local legend until it became a familiar ghost story. I do not know whether the figure I saw was connected to history, to the cottage, to the forest, or to nothing at all. Maybe it was just a trick of light and exhaustion. Maybe the midnight setting made everyone's imagination more active, and I was the only one who happened to see a shape that my mind turned into a person. Maybe I was already expecting something scary because we were walking through the woods at night. But there is one thing I know for certain. I saw something. It was not a normal person. It was not one of the youth workers. It was not someone from our group. It was standing away from the trail in the trees, dressed in clothing from another time, with a white ruffled collar and no head. And it disappeared before I could even decide whether to be afraid. I still think about that night sometimes. I think about the clear sky above the trees, the stars we could see before we entered the forest, the single torch beam moving ahead of us, the sound of boots on the trail, the dark woods pressing in around the group, then that pale shape at the edge of the trees. I do not know what it was. I do not claim it was a ghost. I do not claim it was the spirit of someone from the English Civil War, but I also cannot fully explain why years later I found stories from the same area that sounded so much like what I saw. And whenever I picture Kielder Forest now, I do not picture the reservoir first. I picture a midnight trail, a line of teenagers following one torch through the trees, and a glowing headless figure standing silently just beyond the light. A brief real-world note: severe sleep deprivation can sometimes lead to vivid visual experiences, especially around the boundary between being awake and falling asleep. If anything like this is happening repeatedly now, it is worth discussing with a clinician. nh.uk. Here is the expanded rewrite. When I was about 17, I was dealing with a lot of things in my life that left me with horrible insomnia. It was not the kind of insomnia where you simply stay up an extra hour because you are not tired. It was the kind where your body felt exhausted, but your mind refused to slow down. I would lie in bed for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying things in my head, thinking about problems I could not fix at 3 a.m, and listening to every little sound in the house. Some nights I would fall asleep eventually. Other nights I would give up trying. That particular night was one of the nights where I gave up. It was around 3 a.m, maybe a little later. The whole house was asleep. I had been playing games, watching things online, and trying to keep myself distracted because sitting alone with my thoughts felt worse than staying awake. My room was upstairs. The bathroom was directly across the hall from me, close enough that I could leave my room, take a few steps, and be there. My parents' room was farther down the same hallway, only a little way past the bathroom. I knew that hallway well. During the day, it was completely ordinary. The bathroom door, the carpet, the walls, the doors to the bedrooms, all of it was familiar. But at 3 in the morning, it felt different. The lights were off. There was only a faint amount of light coming from somewhere outside, probably a street light through one of the windows. It was enough to see the vague shape of the hall, but not enough to make anything clear. The corners were dark. The doors looked black against the walls. Every room seemed shut away behind its own silence. I had been awake long enough that I was already tired in a strange way. My eyes burned from looking at a screen. My body felt heavy, but my thoughts were still moving too quickly. I was not fully sleepy, but I was definitely not sharp either. Everything had that slightly unreal feeling that comes after being awake too long. Eventually, I had to use the bathroom. I remember sitting there for a moment, debating whether I really wanted to leave my room. That sounds ridiculous now, but when you are exhausted and it is 3 in the morning, even walking across a dark hallway can feel like more effort than it should. Still, I got up. I opened my bedroom door quietly. I did not want to wake anyone. My stepfather had to work in the morning, and I knew he would be annoyed if I made noise stomping around at that hour. My mom was asleep too, and I did not want anyone asking why I was still awake. I stepped into the hallway. At first, everything was normal. I could see the bathroom door directly across from me. I could see the faint outline of the hall leading toward my parents' bedroom. I was focused on getting to the bathroom and getting back into my room. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone standing farther down the hallway. I immediately thought it was my stepfather. The shape looked like him. He had completely white hair, and he often slept in a white t-shirt and white briefs. In the dim hallway, those things stood out. Even without seeing his face clearly, I recognized the pale shape of him in the darkness. It looked exactly like he had stepped out of his room. For a second, I did not think anything was strange. I assumed he needed to use the bathroom too. I remember thinking that since he had work in the morning, I would let him go first. It was a small, normal thought. I did not want to be in his way, and I did not want him waiting around for me while I was half awake and moving slowly. So I turned toward him. I was about to say something like, "Go ahead," or "You can use it first." But when I turned fully around, there was nobody there. The hallway was empty, not partially empty, not like someone had quickly stepped back into their room. There was simply no one standing there. For a second, I could not move. My brain did not immediately catch up with what I was seeing. I had just seen someone. I was sure I had. I had seen the white hair, the white shirt, the pale shape of a person in the hallway. But now, there was only darkness. The door to my parents' room was closed. The bathroom was empty. The hallway was empty. There was no sound of footsteps, no sound of a door shutting, no voice, nothing. Every hair on my body stood up at once. It was like my whole body reacted before my mind could explain it. My skin prickled. My stomach dropped. My chest tightened. I suddenly felt cold, even though the house was probably the same temperature it had been a minute earlier. And just like that, I did not have to use the bathroom anymore. The need was completely gone. That sounds stupid, but fear can do that. 1 second I was uncomfortable enough to get out of bed. The next second, my body had decided there was nothing in the world more important than getting back into my room. I ran. I did not walk quickly. I did not stand there and try to figure it out. I turned around, went straight back into my bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. I remember pressing the lock into place and checking it more than once. Then I climbed back into bed. I did not turn my lights on immediately. I was too scared to move away from the door. I sat there in the dark, staring at it, trying to listen for anything outside. For a while, I could hear nothing except my own breathing. Then every normal house sound became terrifying. A floorboard creaking somewhere downstairs sounded like someone stepping into the hall. The air conditioner or heater turning on sounded like a door opening. A pipe clicking in the wall made me sit up in bed. The sound of a car driving past outside made me think there was movement near the house. I kept looking toward the door. I kept expecting to see a shadow under it. I kept expecting someone to knock. I kept expecting my stepfather's voice to ask what I was doing awake. But nobody came. I stayed up until the sun came up. I did not sleep at all after that. The night seemed endless. I sat on my bed with my back against the wall, holding my phone, playing games with the sound low, checking the time every few minutes. I kept telling myself I would go to sleep once it got lighter outside. Then I would look at the clock and realize only 10 minutes had passed. At some point, the darkness outside the window began to fade. The black sky turned dark blue, then gray. Then finally, the first weak morning light started coming through the room. That was when I finally felt slightly safer. Daylight changes everything. The hallway I had been terrified of a few hours earlier became an ordinary hallway again. The doors looked normal. The carpet looked normal. The bathroom was right where it had always been. Nothing seemed out of place. I did not tell anyone immediately. I think part of me was embarrassed. I was 17. I knew how ridiculous it might sound to say, I saw my stepfather in the hallway, and then he disappeared. I knew people could say I was exhausted, that I had been gaming too late, that I had imagined it, or that I had seen a shadow and filled in the rest. And maybe they would have been right. But I did not want to hear it right away. I wanted to hold on to the possibility that there had been some explanation I had not considered. Maybe my stepfather had actually come out of his room and gone back inside before I fully turned around. Maybe I had caught only a glimpse of him from the corner of my eye, and the rest of my brain filled in a shape that was no longer there. That was possible. I had not been sleeping. I had been awake for far too long. I had been staring at screens in the middle of the night, sitting in a dark room, running on stress and exhaustion. My eyes could have played tricks on me. The small amount of light in the hallway could have turned a doorframe, a hanging shirt, or a reflection into something that looked like a person. The human brain is good at making shapes out of almost nothing, especially when you are tired, especially when you are already stressed, especially when you catch something in the edge of your vision instead of looking directly at it. I know all of that. But in that moment, I did not see a vague shape. I saw my stepfather. I saw the white hair. I saw the white t-shirt. I saw the white briefs. Those were details I knew well enough that I did not question them until I turned around and found no one there. That is what gave me chills. Not that I saw something unfamiliar. I saw someone I knew. Someone who should have been in bed at 3 a.m. Someone who looked normal enough that I was about to speak to him. Then there was nobody. For years afterward, I thought about whether I should have checked on him. I did not. I was too scared to walk down the hallway again that night. The next morning, he was fine. He went about his day like nothing had happened. As far as I knew, he had been asleep the entire time. I never asked him whether he had gotten up around 3 a.m. Maybe I should have. Maybe he would have said he had gone to the bathroom and then returned to bed before I turned around. Maybe that would have solved everything. Maybe I would have learned that I had only seen him for a second, and the whole fear came from being tired and startled. But I did not ask. Part of me did not want an answer. Or maybe I was afraid there would not be one. That is the strange thing about experiences like that. Sometimes the uncertainty becomes part of the fear. You can imagine a logical explanation, but you do not know for sure. Then the memory keeps replaying because your mind never gets to close the story. I can still remember exactly where I was standing. I can remember the bathroom door across the hall. I can remember the dim light coming from the far end of the hallway. I can remember looking toward my parents' bedroom and seeing that pale shape at the edge of my vision. Then I can remember the empty hallway when I turned. There was nothing there. No person, no clothes hanging on a chair, no open door, no obvious shape that could have fooled me. Only the hall. And it suddenly felt much longer than it did during the day. After that night, I became more careful about staying up too late. Not immediately. Teenagers do not always learn lessons quickly. I still had insomnia. I still stayed up playing games sometimes because I did not know what else to do when sleep would not come. But I became more aware of what exhaustion could do to your mind. There were other nights where I would catch movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow would seem to shift. A coat hanging near a doorway would look like a person until I stared at it. A reflection in a window would make me jump. But nothing ever felt as real as that moment. Nothing else made me turn around expecting to speak to someone and find no one there. I think that is why it stayed with me. It was not dramatic. There was no voice, no touch, no object moving, no creature standing at the end of the hall. Just a normal person-shaped figure in familiar sleeping clothes. That made it worse. There is something more unsettling about a familiar image being wrong than about seeing something obviously frightening. If I had seen a shadow monster, I could have told myself it was my imagination. If I had heard a strange sound, I could have blamed the house. But I saw my stepfather, or at least I thought I did, and I knew him well enough to recognize the way he looked at night. Years later, I still do not know what happened. Maybe it was insomnia. Maybe it was the beginning of a dream slipping into reality. Maybe I was awake enough to walk out of my room, but tired enough that my brain filled in something that was not actually there. Maybe I had seen him in the hallway a few nights before, or seen him walk around in those clothes enough times that my mind used that image automatically when I saw a pale shape in the dark. Maybe the lighting was just right. Maybe the angle of the hall created an illusion. Maybe I did not really see white hair and a white shirt at all. Maybe I saw light reflecting off a wall, then my exhausted brain turned it into the most familiar explanation available. Or maybe my stepfather did get up that night and simply moved away before I could turn around. That would be the simplest explanation. But I still do not understand why there was no sound. I did not hear a door close. I did not hear him walk away. I did not hear the bathroom door open. I did not hear him go back into his room. It was as though the figure only existed in the moment I saw it from the corner of my eye. Then it was gone. I am not sure whether that makes it a ghost story. I do not think of it that way. I do not know if there was anything paranormal in the house. Nothing else like that happened to me there. I never saw a strange figure again. I never heard someone walking in the hallway when nobody was home. There were no other events that made me think something was haunting the place. It was one moment, one exhausted night, one glance, and one empty hallway. But it still gives me chills. Sometimes I think about how close I came to speaking to it. If I had said, "Go ahead," would I have heard my own voice answer back? Would the figure have moved? Would I have realized it was something ordinary? Would I have looked down the hall and found my stepfather standing there, confused about why I was awake? I do not know. Instead, I turned, saw nobody, and ran. I locked my door and waited for sunrise like a kid afraid of the dark, even though I was 17 and old enough to know that most fears have ordinary explanations. The thing is, knowing that does not always make the memory less frightening. You can understand that sleep deprivation can affect perception. You can understand that fear makes details feel sharper. You can understand that the human mind fills dark spaces with things it expects to see. But when you are standing in a hallway at 3 in the morning, exhausted and alone, and you turn to speak to someone you are certain is there, only to find an empty space, none of those explanations feel helpful. All you feel is the cold rush through your body. All you remember is the hallway, and all you want is for the sun to come up. Before the next story begins, thank you for staying here in the dark. If this is your first visit, subscribe to Wickless Night for more true stories made for the late hours, when the world is quiet and every little noise feels important. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has made you look around the room so far. Now, let's continue. When I was 19, I lived in a house with roommates, and for a while, strange little things kept happening. Nothing started in a dramatic way. There was no one night where we all woke up to screaming, broken furniture, or something standing at the end of a hallway. It was smaller than that at first. Easy to ignore. Easy to explain away. A thing would be sitting somewhere, and later it would be in a different place. The television would turn on by itself. A door that someone remembered shutting would be open later. A cup, a book, a remote, a jacket, something ordinary would seem to have moved without anyone remembering touching it. At first we blamed each other. That was the obvious answer. Living with roommates means things get moved all the time. Someone picks up a remote and leaves it in another room. Someone borrows something without asking. Someone cleans a table and puts an object somewhere else. Someone has friends over. Someone is tired, distracted, drunk, or rushing out the door and cannot remember where they set something down. So whenever one of us noticed something strange, the others would laugh. Which one of you moved this? Stop messing with my stuff. Did you turn the TV on? That kind of thing. Usually, whoever was accused would deny it, and we would forget about it. But after a while, the little things began adding up. It was not one big event we could point to. It was the number of times something happened without anyone taking responsibility for it. The TV would come on when we were all in another room. A thing would be missing, then appear somewhere none of us had been. Someone would swear they had shut a door only for another roommate to find it open. We all started becoming more aware of the house. The house itself was not especially old or obviously creepy, at least not from the outside. It was just where we lived. A normal place with a living room, a kitchen, bedrooms, a hallway, and the usual roommate clutter everywhere. There were dishes in the sink sometimes, laundry in baskets, shoes by the door, empty cans around after weekends, jackets thrown over chairs, and random things on every flat surface. At 19, most of us did not care much about keeping things neat. The house had that lived-in look, where every room seemed to belong to several people at once. The kitchen had everyone's food mixed together. The living room had different blankets, chargers, game controllers, and whatever else had been left around. The dining table was sometimes used for meals, but more often it was where mail, grocery bags, keys, and half-finished drinks ended up. It was not a haunted mansion. It was just a messy shared house. That may have been why the strange things took us so long to take seriously. There were always too many easy explanations. Maybe the TV remote was wedged in a couch cushion. Maybe somebody's cat had stepped on something. If there was a pet around. Maybe the electrical system was weird. Maybe one of us had forgotten what we did after a few beers. Maybe someone was playing a joke and refusing to admit it. The first few times the TV turned on by itself, We blamed the remote. Maybe a button had been stuck. Maybe another remote nearby was on the same frequency. Maybe there had been a power flicker. But then it happened when no one was near it. One time, I remember sitting in my room when the television in the living room suddenly came on. The volume was not even low. It was loud enough that I heard it through the wall. At first, I assumed one of my roommates had come home and turned it on. Then I walked out and found the living room empty. The TV was on. The remote was sitting on the coffee table. No one else was in the room. I remember standing there for a moment, looking at the screen, trying to decide if I should be annoyed or scared. Mostly, I was annoyed. I turned it off and went back to my room. At that point, I still thought there had to be a normal reason. Then, there were the moving things. One roommate would come into the kitchen looking for something, like a lighter or a set of keys, and ask if anyone had moved it. Everyone would say no. We would search for it, not find it, and then later, someone would see it sitting in the middle of a table or on a shelf, where it definitely had not been before. Those moments always created an awkward silence. Not because we immediately believed there was a ghost. We did not. But because it became harder to tell whether someone was lying, whether someone had been forgetful, or whether we were all just terrible at remembering where things belonged. One night, someone's coffee mug went missing. It was not an important object. It was just a mug, one of those ordinary cups that had probably been used so often nobody would care if it disappeared. But the roommate who owned it remembered rinsing it and leaving it on the kitchen counter. Later, it was gone. We looked in the sink. Not there. We checked the dishwasher. Not there. We checked the table, the living room, and even the bedrooms, in case someone had used it. Nothing. Then, the next day, it was sitting on top of a shelf in the hallway. Not broken, not dirty, just sitting there. No one admitted putting it there. We laughed about it, but not in the same way as before. It was the kind of laughter people use when they do not know how else to react. Then there was the thing I still have the hardest time explaining. I saw something in the air. Even now, I do not know the right words for it. The closest description I can give is that it looked like a floating crease moving through the house. Not a person, not a shadow, not smoke, not a reflection. It looked almost like the air itself had folded slightly. Imagine looking at a clear plastic sheet that has a crease in it. The crease catches light differently than the rest of the plastic. It bends the image behind it. You can see it move even though the material itself is nearly invisible. That is what it looked like. A crease in the air. At first, I thought something was wrong with my eyes. It happened while I was in the living room. I do not remember whether it was afternoon or evening, but I remember the room being lit normally. It was not dark. I was not standing in a hallway half asleep at 3 a.m. I was awake, looking around, doing something ordinary. Then I noticed a distortion near the far side of the room. It moved slowly. At first, I thought I was seeing a heat wave. Sometimes air can shimmer near a vent, a radiator, or a window when temperatures are different. But there was no heat source there. No sunlight coming through in a way that could explain it. No smoke, no steam, no obvious reason for the air to bend. The shape drifted across the room, not in a straight line exactly. It seemed to move through the space as if it were following an invisible path. It was narrow, irregular, and hard to focus on. Every time I tried to look directly at it, it seemed to become less clear. But when I looked slightly to the side, I could see it again. The room behind it looked warped. The edge of a wall bent slightly. The shape of furniture seemed to shift through the crease. Then it moved farther through the room. I remember standing there, rubbing my eyes. I thought maybe I had stared at a screen too long. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe I was getting a migraine. Maybe I had some kind of visual disturbance that would pass if I sat down. But then one of my roommates walked in. I did not tell them what I was seeing right away. I watched them enter the room and look around. They stopped. Then they asked, "Do you see that?" I remember feeling my stomach drop. I said something like, "The weird thing in the air?" They nodded. Another roommate came in later and saw it too. That was what made it difficult to dismiss. If I had been alone, I would have accepted that something was wrong with my eyes. I would have blamed stress, exhaustion, vision problems, anything. But the other people in the house saw the same strange distortion. We all described it slightly differently. One person said it looked like heat waves. Another said it looked like something invisible moving through the room. I called it a floating crease because that was the only comparison that made sense to me. It moved through the house more than once, not constantly, not every day, but enough times that we started paying attention to it. Sometimes it seemed to move near a doorway, sometimes across the living room. Once, I thought I saw it passing down the hall, a narrow warping of the air that seemed to disappear as soon as it reached the darker part of the house. We joked about it at first. We called it the thing. We would say, "Did the thing show up again?" But as the other strange events continued, the jokes began carrying more nervousness. The TV turning on, objects moving, the weird distortion. It became easy for us to start saying we had a ghost, not because any of us had proof, not because we suddenly became serious believers in paranormal activity, but because the word ghost was easier than admitting we did not know what was happening. We did not know whether the house had an electrical issue. We did not know whether we were all messing with one another. We did not know whether the house had drafts, reflections, bad wiring, or something else that could explain the events. And we did not know what else to call a floating crease in the air that several people saw. So eventually, we came to the conclusion that there was a ghost in the house. It was not a dramatic conclusion. Nobody held a seance. Nobody called a priest. Nobody bought ghost hunting equipment. We were 19. We had roommates, cheap beer, bills, jobs, and all the normal chaos of living with other young people. The possibility of a ghost became just another strange thing about the house. But then one night, we decided to address it directly. We were all sitting at the dinner table. It was one of those relaxed evenings where nobody had anything urgent to do. Someone had brought beer. We were sitting around talking, probably telling stories, and laughing about things that had happened in the house. The dining table was cluttered as usual. There were cans or bottles, snacks, maybe someone's phone, maybe a pack of cigarettes or a lighter, and whatever else had been left there throughout the day. The room was warm. The house was louder than it usually was because we were all together and talking over one another. Eventually, the conversation turned to the ghost. Someone brought up the TV. Someone else brought up the missing mug. Then someone mentioned the floating crease. We started telling the stories again, comparing what we remembered, laughing at how stupid it sounded when we said it out loud. One roommate said, "Maybe it just wants attention." Another said, "Maybe it is bored." Someone else said, "Maybe it is mad that we do not clean." That one was probably true if there was anything in the house with standards. We all laughed. Then, in the middle of the joking, one of us called out to it. I do not remember who spoke first. It may have been me. It may have been one of the others. But someone looked around the room and said something like, "All right, if you are here, stop being weird and sneaking around." That got everyone laughing again. Then we told it to come have a few beers with us. We said if it was going to live in the house, it might as well sit down at the table. Someone offered it a drink. Someone joked that it needed to start paying rent. That was the part everyone liked. "If you are going to reside in our house," someone said, "we need rent money from you." We laughed harder than we probably should have. We were not trying to be cruel. We were not trying to challenge anything. We were just 19-year-olds sitting around with beers, trying to make something unsettling feel less serious. Humor was easier than fear. I remember looking around the room while we said it. Part of me was waiting for something to happen. A light to flicker, the television to come on, the floating crease to move through the air, a chair to shift. Nothing did. The kitchen stayed quiet. The living room beyond the table stayed quiet. The beer stayed where it was. No one heard a voice or saw a figure. We laughed, talked about something else, and eventually the night moved on. But after that evening, nothing strange happened again. No more objects moving. No more TV turning itself on. No more floating crease moving through the air. No more weird little disturbances that made us wonder whether someone was playing a joke. At first, we did not notice. Days passed, then weeks. At some point, someone mentioned that the TV had not turned on by itself in a while. Another roommate said they had not seen the strange air distortion lately. We started realizing that everything had stopped after that dinner table conversation. That was when the joke turned into one of those stories you keep telling. We asked it to pay rent, and it left. We told it to stop being weird. Maybe it did not like our beer. Maybe it realized we were worse roommates than it was. We laughed about it, but there was always a little discomfort under the humor. Because no matter what the actual cause had been, the timing was strange. The house had been full of minor, unexplained things for a while. Then we sat around, joked directly about the possibility of a ghost, told it to stop sneaking around, and demanded rent. After that, everything ended. Of course, there are normal explanations. Maybe we had finally stopped paying attention. Once you decide something is happening, you can become hyper-aware of every odd sound, every misplaced object, every flickering screen. Then, after you laugh about it and move on, you may simply stop noticing the same things. Maybe the TV issue was a technical problem that fixed itself. Maybe someone had accidentally changed a setting. Maybe the remote had a bad button and it stopped acting up. Maybe the objects were moved by roommates who honestly did not remember doing it. Maybe the floating crease was some kind of light distortion, a reflection from a window, an air current from a vent, or an optical effect created by the layout of the house. Maybe several people noticed it, because once one person pointed it out, everyone began looking for it. That can happen. People influence each other without meaning to. A vague thing becomes more definite when someone else sees it too. A weird sound becomes footsteps once someone calls it footsteps. A shadow becomes a figure once someone says it looks like one. I understand that. But the floating crease is still the part I think about. It was not just a vague shadow. It seemed to move. It bent the light behind it, and more than one person saw it. I do not know what it was. I do not know whether there was ever a ghost in that house. I do not know whether we were all simply young, distracted, tired, drinking, and living in a place where small problems became bigger stories. But I do know that, after we addressed it, everything stopped. Maybe coincidence. Maybe the house settled. Maybe the electrical issue ended. Maybe we got used to living there. Or maybe something heard us, decided we were too annoying to live with, and moved on. Either way, we never saw it again. And to this day, whenever I remember that house, I think about the strange crease drifting through the air, warping the room behind it like reality had folded in on itself for a second. Then I think about a group of 19-year-olds sitting around a dinner table with beers, telling an unseen presence that it either needed to join us properly or start paying rent. And somehow, after that, the house went quiet. My wife came downstairs to the den one night to say goodnight. It was an ordinary evening. Nothing about the house felt strange before that. We had probably both been doing our own thing for a while, winding down at the end of the day. I was in the den, and she had come downstairs before heading up to bed. The den was in the lower part of the house, separate enough from the main floor that sounds upstairs could sometimes seem distant or muffled. It was one of those rooms where I could sit alone, watch something, play around on my phone, or just have some quiet after everything else in the house had settled down. My wife came in, said goodnight, and stayed for a minute to chat. We were not talking about anything serious. It was just normal end-of-the-day conversation. Maybe we were talking about something that happened earlier, something we needed to do the next day, or something one of the cats had done. The cats had their usual habits, and one of them was always finding a way to step on something, knock something over, or make us question whether we had heard a strange noise. While we were talking, we heard what sounded like someone speaking upstairs. At first, neither of us reacted much. The sound seemed to be coming from the main floor, somewhere near the living room. It was faint enough that we could not make out the words right away. It sounded like a man talking, possibly from a television program or something playing through the sound system. That was not immediately unusual in our house. Occasionally, one of the cats would step on the television remote. Sometimes they would walk across the couch, put a paw down in exactly the wrong place, and turn the TV on. In our setup, that could also turn on the sound bar. It had happened before. You would be in another room and suddenly hear the television playing, only to walk into the living room and find a cat sitting near the remote, looking completely innocent. So when we heard the voice upstairs, that was the first explanation that came to mind. One of the cats had stepped on the remote. Maybe the TV had turned on. Maybe the sound bar had switched on too. We did not think much of it at first. We kept talking for another moment, but the voice continued. It was not loud, but it had a strange rhythm to it. The person speaking sounded calm and serious. It did not sound like a normal movie, a sitcom, news program, or something we would usually have playing in the background. After a minute or two, we decided to go upstairs and check. We walked out of the den and headed toward the main floor. The closer we got, the clearer the voice became. It was definitely coming from the living room. I remember expecting to walk in and see the television on. I expected the screen to be glowing with some random channel, a streaming app, a commercial, or maybe something the cat had somehow selected. But when we entered the living room, the TV was off. The screen was black. There was no image, no channel, no menu, no visual indication that anything had been playing. The soundbar, however, was on, and the voice was coming through it. At first, I stood there trying to understand what I was hearing. It was a male voice, not loud or aggressive, not distorted in a way that made it sound obviously mechanical. It sounded like someone reading or reciting something. The words came slowly, with pauses between phrases. The delivery was serious and measured, almost like a sermon, an audiobook, or an old religious broadcast. Then I realized what it sounded like. Biblical passages. The soundbar was playing what sounded like a man reading scripture. That was the part that made the moment immediately uncomfortable. My wife and I are not religious. We do not watch religious television programming. We do not listen to religious podcasts. We do not have an Alexa or a smart speaker in the living room set up to play scripture. We had not been watching a church service. We had not put on an audiobook. Neither of us had searched for religious content or played anything remotely connected to it. There was no obvious reason for our soundbar to be quietly reciting what sounded like passages from the Bible in the middle of the night. For a second, we just stood there listening. The television was still off. The room was otherwise normal. The cats were nearby, doing whatever cats do when something strange happens in a house. One might have been sitting on the couch. Another may have been moving around like nothing unusual was happening. None of them looked scared or reacted to the sound in any dramatic way. But the male voice continued. The soundbar kept speaking. It was not just a few random words. It sounded continuous, like a recording had been playing before we walked into the room and was continuing without interruption. The voice seemed to move through one sentence after another. There was a cadence to it that made it sound structured, almost formal. I remember looking at the television remote. I remember looking around the living room as though there might be another device hidden somewhere. There was nothing obvious. My first thought was still technical. Maybe the soundbar had connected to something nearby through Bluetooth. Maybe someone in the neighborhood had accidentally paired a phone to it. Maybe a nearby television station, radio signal, or smart device was somehow being picked up through the speaker. That seemed more likely than anything supernatural. But even if there was a technical explanation, it did not make the moment less unnerving. Because it was late. Because the TV was off. Because we had not played anything religious. And because the voice had started while we were downstairs, sounding faint and distant at first, then becoming clear only after we went up to investigate. I walked over to the soundbar. I unplugged it. The voice stopped immediately. For a few seconds, the room was silent. That should have been the end of it. I expected to plug it back in, let it reset, and move on. Maybe the system had glitched. Maybe it had held a strange connection. Maybe it had turned on because of an accidental button press. I thought that disconnecting the power would clear whatever issue was happening. So I plugged it back in. The soundbar powered on. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the male voice returned. It continued exactly as though it had never stopped. That was the moment the situation felt worse. If it had simply been an app or a signal, I expected it to disappear after the reset. I expected the soundbar to come back online normally, maybe with no sound at all, maybe with a default startup tone. Instead, a few seconds after I plugged it back in, the reading started again. The same voice, the same serious tone, the same scripture-like words moving through the room. My wife and I looked at each other. Neither of us said much. There was no point pretending it was not strange anymore. It was strange. That did not mean it was paranormal, but it was strange enough that neither of us wanted to keep standing there listening to it. I unplugged the soundbar again. This time, I left it unplugged. I did not try to reset it again that night. I did not turn the television on. I did not start going through menus or testing cables. I did not want to sit there in the dark living room, messing with electronics while the possibility remained that the voice would start again. Maybe that sounds dramatic, but it was one of those moments where you do not want more information right away. You just want the sound to stop. So I left the sound bar off. The living room became quiet again. The TV screen remained black. The cats moved around normally. Nothing else happened that night. But I remember going upstairs afterward and feeling more aware of every sound in the house. A house that had felt normal an hour earlier suddenly seemed full of quiet electronic possibilities. Every small click made me wonder if the sound bar was turning back on. Every faint sound from downstairs made me wonder whether the male voice had started again. It never did. The next day, I plugged the sound bar back in. I waited. Nothing happened. I tested it carefully. I turned on the TV. I checked the volume. I tried playing normal audio. Everything worked the way it was supposed to. The soundbar connected normally. The television played normally. There was no unexpected voice. There was no scripture. There was no strange signal coming through. The device acted as though nothing had happened. And after that, there were no further problems. No random religious programming. No unexplained audio, no soundbar turning on by itself, no male voice speaking through the room at night. That was the end of it, at least as far as the soundbar was concerned. But the incident stayed with us. The obvious explanation is that it picked up some kind of signal. That is still what I believe most likely happened. Maybe someone nearby had paired a device to it without realizing. Bluetooth connections can be strange, especially in neighborhoods where there are lots of phones, televisions, speakers, smart devices, and wireless systems operating close together. Maybe it connected to a nearby phone that had religious audio playing. Maybe a television app or audio stream had been left open somewhere. Maybe the soundbar had a feature that allowed it to receive a signal from another device, and it connected automatically. Maybe it was picking up something from a neighbor's television or audio equipment. Maybe a glitch caused it to replay some buried piece of content from a previous connection. Maybe it was a radio frequency issue, some strange electronic overlap that brought a voice through in a way neither of us understood. All of that is possible. And honestly, I prefer those explanations. I do not think there was anything in the house trying to communicate with us. I do not think a ghost had decided to recite scripture through our speaker system. I do not think the soundbar was possessed. But the technical explanation does not completely erase how unnerving it felt in the moment. There was something about the voice itself. It was not music. It was not an ad. It was not the normal, loud, chaotic sound of someone's TV accidentally turning on. It was calm, measured, serious. It sounded like someone was reading from something ancient and important, one phrase at a time. And it was happening in a house where no one had chosen to play it. The fact that the TV was off made it worse. If the screen had been on, I could have looked at whatever channel or app was running. I could have checked what program it was. I could have seen a logo, a title, a streaming service, a menu, anything that would give the sound a source. But there was nothing. The television was off. The soundbar was on, and the voice was coming from it alone. That small separation made the whole thing feel wrong. It was like hearing someone talk from a room where nobody was standing. I remember thinking about all the ordinary reasons the soundbar might have turned on. The cat stepping on the remote was one. We had seen that happen. A cat could step on the wrong button and bring the TV system to life without anyone touching it, but the cats could not explain the content. They might have turned something on, but they did not choose a male voice reading religious passages. Unless the system had somehow automatically returned to a hidden audio source, there was no obvious chain of events that made sense. Then again, technology does strange things. Devices connect to things you do not know exist. Bluetooth speakers receive signals from places you do not expect. Smart TVs open apps by accident. Sound bars remember inputs. Phones connect to devices without anyone realizing it. Sometimes you press one button and a completely unrelated function starts because the equipment is old, glitching, or poorly designed. That is probably what happened. A weird signal, a Bluetooth issue, some kind of electronic interference, but neither of us ever figured it out. We never found a nearby device that had been connected. We never learned the source of the voice. We never heard the same audio again. And we never knew why unplugging the soundbar briefly stopped it, only for the reading to continue a few seconds after it was plugged back in. That was the detail that stayed with me. It did not reset into silence. It continued, like the sound had been waiting, like it had already been in progress somewhere else, and the soundbar simply reconnected to it. That may be exactly what happened. Maybe a neighbor's phone or device was streaming something, and when the soundbar powered back up, it automatically rejoined the same connection. That would make sense. But in the moment, we did not know that. We were standing in a quiet living room at night, staring at a dark television, while a speaker calmly delivered words neither of us had chosen to hear. That is why it felt creepy. Not because we believed it was evil, not because we thought the house was haunted, not because we suddenly became religious. It felt creepy because it happened without context. The sound came first, faintly, while we were downstairs. Then we followed it. Then we found an empty-looking living room with a black TV screen and a sound bar speaking in a voice that did not belong to anyone in the house. There is something unsettling about sounds without a visible source. A strange noise in a house can be explained by pipes, floors, wind, or animals. A television program can be explained by someone leaving the TV on. A voice through a speaker can be explained by technology. But when you hear a voice in the background, go to find it and discover that the expected source is off. Your mind has a moment of panic before logic catches up. You start looking around. You wonder if someone else is in the house. You wonder if a phone is playing somewhere. You wonder if a speaker is connected to something you do not know about. You try to locate the sound because locating it makes it less frightening. That was what we did. We checked the television. We looked at the sound bar. We unplugged it. We plugged it back in. We waited. And when it started again, we decided we had heard enough. After that, it became one of those strange household stories you mention every once in a while. Someone will bring up a weird tech problem. Someone will talk about a Bluetooth speaker connecting to a neighbor's device. Someone will mention a cat turning on the TV. Then we remember that night, the sound bar, the dark screen, the male voice reading what sounded like biblical passages. The moment it resumed after being unplugged and plugged back in, we still do not know why it happened. Maybe the source was something completely ordinary. Maybe it was nearby the whole time. Maybe a neighbor had some religious broadcast or podcast playing, and our soundbar accidentally picked it up. Maybe it was a Bluetooth issue. Maybe it was a random pairing. Maybe it was interference. Maybe the system had glitched in a way that made no sense, but never repeated. Whatever the cause was, it only happened once. And that is almost more unsettling than if it had happened repeatedly. If it had happened every night, we could have started troubleshooting patterns. We could have checked connections, asked neighbors, changed settings, replaced cables, or called the manufacturer. But it happened one time. One late-night conversation. One faint voice from upstairs. One walk into the living room. One soundbar speaking scripture to nobody. Then, nothing ever again. That made it impossible to solve. The device worked normally after that. The cats continued being cats. The remote still occasionally got stepped on. The TV still turned on by accident once in a while. But we never again heard that male voice. And even though I am almost certain there was some technical reason for it, I still remember how it felt to stand in the living room while it happened. The house was quiet. The television was off. The sound bar was on. And a calm male voice was speaking to us from somewhere we could not see. My siblings are older than me, and unfortunately, they lost many people they loved when they were still very young. It was not one loss. It was not one tragedy that the family had time to process before life moved on. It was loss after loss, the kind that changes the way people grow up. By the time I was old enough to understand the stories, my older siblings already carried memories that felt too heavy for people their age. 4 of their friends died in a car accident when they were only 16. 2 others overdosed. Then there was another car accident. There were more losses than anyone should have had to deal with so young. It was the kind of grief that becomes part of a person's life, even when they do not talk about it every day. People who have gone through that much can laugh, work, raise children, and live normal-looking lives. But there is still a part of them that remembers every name, every phone call, every funeral, every empty chair, and every moment when they realized someone was never coming back. My sister was one of the people most affected by it. She had lost friends she had grown up with, people she had known when they were all still kids, before anyone imagined that some of them would be gone before adulthood. She had gone through the kind of grief that leaves you constantly waiting for bad news. You start to understand how quickly something can happen. A normal night can turn into a phone call. A drive home can turn into a disaster. A person can be there one day and become a memory the next. Because of that, I think she always carried a certain fear with her. Not necessarily fear that controlled her life, but an awareness, a feeling that things could change in a second, that accidents were real, that people did not always get warnings, that you could love someone deeply and still not be able to protect them from everything. Then, she had an almost fatal accident of her own. She was driving when another vehicle came dangerously close to hitting her from the side. It was the kind of crash people call getting T-boned, where one car slams into the side of another at high speed. There is almost no time to react. You are moving forward, you look up, and suddenly there is a vehicle coming straight toward the part of the car where you are sitting. She told us that everything seemed to slow down. That is something people say after terrible accidents, and I never fully understood it until I heard her describe it. She said she saw the other car coming and knew there was no time to get away. There was no room to turn, no time to brake enough, no way to make sense of how quickly it was all happening. Then, in the passenger seat beside her, she saw someone. It was a friend who had died, not someone who merely looked like her, not a shadow, not a vague feeling. My sister said she saw her clearly enough to recognize her immediately. Her friend was sitting beside her, in the seat where no one should have been. She said her friend looked at her and said her name. Then, she said, "You're going to be okay." My sister has never talked about it like a dream. She did not say she had dozed off. She did not say she imagined a voice in the middle of the crash. She said her friend was there. For those few seconds, while another car was coming toward her, her dead friend was beside her, telling her she would be okay. Then the crash either missed in the worst possible way or happened in a way that did not kill her. I do not know every detail of how she survived, whether the other car swerved at the last second, whether she moved, whether there was some impact that could have been much worse, or whether something in the road changed the outcome. What mattered was that she lived. She got through it, and afterward, she could not stop thinking about what she had seen. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was the brain doing something strange under extreme stress. When people are terrified, their minds can create intense experiences. Time can seem to slow down. Memories can become sharper. People can see familiar faces or hear familiar voices in moments of danger. A part of the brain may reach for someone comforting, someone loved, someone associated with safety. That is possible. It may even be the most logical explanation. But for my sister, it did not feel like a random thought. It felt like someone had come to sit beside her when she thought she might die. Someone who had already been taken from her. Someone who knew her name. Someone who told her she would be okay. The second experience was even harder to dismiss. It happened years later. By then, my sister had children of her own. She was a mother, and like most mothers, she had developed that constant awareness of where her kids were, whether they were breathing normally, whether they had eaten, whether they were warm enough, whether they were sleeping too quietly, whether something felt off. Her youngest child had asthma. That meant nighttime could be especially stressful. Asthma can become serious quickly, especially in children. Breathing problems do not always look dramatic at first. A child may seem tired, they may be quiet, They may not complain. Then, suddenly, they are struggling for air. One night, my sister was asleep. She told us that she woke up to the sight of another friend who had died standing at the bottom of her bed. This friend was not just a blurry shape in the room. My sister recognized her. She said the friend was urgent, not angry, not threatening. Panicked, she kept saying, "Check on the kids." Then she said, "Where's the kids?" Again and again. "Check on the kids. Where's the kids?" My sister woke up immediately, not slowly, not groggy, not confused in the normal way someone wakes in the middle of the night. She shot up. Something about the urgency in the voice got through to her before she had time to think. She got out of bed and went to check on the children. That was when she found her youngest. Her child was blue, barely responsive, almost dead. My sister rushed her to the emergency room. She lived. That is the part that matters most. She lived. But my sister has never forgotten what woke her up. If she had not gotten up at that moment, if she had not checked on the kids, if she had ignored the feeling or rolled over and gone back to sleep, things could have ended very differently. That thought has stayed with all of us. My sister believes her friend woke her. She believes that whatever came to the bottom of her bed that night was not there to scare her. It was there because her child needed help. It was there because someone had to get her up before it was too late. And honestly, after hearing what happened, it is hard to blame her for feeling that way. There are people who will say it was maternal instinct. Maybe her body heard something before her mind understood it. Maybe her child made a small sound. Maybe there was a change in breathing that registered somewhere deep in her brain. Maybe she had already been worried, even if she did not consciously know it. Maybe the dream or vision was her mind's way of forcing her awake. That explanation makes sense. Mothers can be incredibly sensitive to their children. People can wake up because something feels wrong before they know why. The mind can transform a faint sound, an uneasy feeling, or a half-heard breath into an image that demands action. But there is still something about the exact words that gives me chills. Check on the kids. Where's the kids? It was not vague. It was not a random nightmare. It was direct. It was urgent. And it led my sister straight to her child in time. I do not know what I believe. I am not saying that dead people definitely come back to warn the living. I cannot prove that. I do not know whether these experiences were spiritual, psychological, emotional, or some mixture of all three. But I know what my sister has been through. I know how many people she lost when she was young. I know how deeply those losses affected her. And I know that, in two of the worst moments of her life, she felt like people she loved and lost were suddenly near her again. The first time, one of them appeared beside her when she thought she was about to die. The second time, another appeared at the bottom of her bed and told her to check on her children. In both cases, someone survived. That is what makes it hard to brush off as nothing. My sister never treated those experiences like entertainment. She did not go looking for ghost stories or try to make herself seem special. She had already seen enough tragedy in real life. She did not need to invent more. When she talks about those moments, she is not dramatic. She is serious. There is grief in the way she tells them. But there is gratitude, too. She believes the friends she lost are not entirely gone. Maybe they cannot come back in the normal way. Maybe they cannot sit at the table, laugh, call, drive over, or grow older with everyone else. But she feels that, in the moments that mattered most, they found a way to be there, to tell her she would be okay, to tell her to check on her child. And I think that belief has helped her carry everything she has lost. When someone loses that many people young, grief does not disappear. It changes shape. Sometimes it becomes sadness. Sometimes it becomes anger. Sometimes it becomes guilt. Sometimes it becomes fear every time the phone rings late at night. But sometimes, maybe, it becomes a feeling that love does not disappear as quickly as a person does. Maybe that is all those experiences were: love, memory, trauma, instinct, and survival colliding in the worst possible moments. Or maybe it was something more. I do not know. But I know my sister was almost killed, and she lived after seeing a dead friend beside her telling her, "You're gonna be okay." I know her child was blue and close to dying, and she woke up after another dead friend stood at the end of her bed saying, "Check on the kids." And I know that if those things had happened to me, I would never forget them either. About 15 years ago, I was driving down a very quiet road near my neighborhood on a dark fall night. It was one of those roads that people who live nearby know well, but most other people probably would not have any reason to use. It was not a main road. It did not lead past stores, restaurants, or busy intersections. It was mostly lined with large, old-fashioned houses that sat back from the street behind wide lawns and old trees. During the day, it was a nice road. The houses were the kind you noticed when you passed them. Some had wraparound porches, some had tall windows, peaked roofs, long driveways, and yards that seemed much bigger than anything else in the area. A few looked beautifully maintained. Others looked like they had been there for so long that they had become part of the landscape. At night, though, the road had a different feeling. There were very few streetlights. The trees on both sides leaned over the road in places, especially when the leaves were still on the branches. By fall, most of the leaves had started to turn and drop, but there were still enough hanging above the road to make the darkness feel uneven. One moment, my headlights would light up a stretch of pavement and the front lawns of houses. The next, I would be driving through a patch of shadow where the trees seemed to close in overhead. It was not a dangerous road, at least not in the usual sense. There were not many cars. There were almost never pedestrians. You would not expect to see people walking around there after dark unless they lived nearby, were walking a dog, or were coming home from somewhere. That was one reason I noticed what I saw so clearly. I was not alone in the car that night. There were other people with me, although I do not remember exactly where everyone was sitting or what we had been doing before we ended up on that road. We may have been heading home after being out somewhere. We may have been driving around talking. It was one of those ordinary nights that did not feel important at the time. The people in the car were talking about something. I remember hearing voices around me, but I do not remember the conversation. Whatever it was normal enough that I was only half listening while I drove. My attention was mostly on the road ahead. It was cold enough that the windows were up. The heat may have been running low in the car. The air outside had that dry fall smell, a mix of damp leaves, dirt, and wood smoke from fireplaces somewhere in the neighborhood. There was nothing unusual about the weather. No storm, no heavy fog, no rain. Just a clear, dark autumn night. I was driving at a normal speed. The road was empty ahead of us. No headlights coming toward us. No taillights in front of us. No one standing near the curb. Nothing then. As we came around a gentle bend in the road, my headlights swept across the lawn of one of the large houses. At first I thought I was seeing lawn decorations. That was my first reaction, because the shape of the group did not make sense. There were too many pale forms standing out against the darkness. They looked almost unreal in the headlights. Then I realized they were people. There were maybe 15 to 20 of them. They were standing in a circle on the front lawn. Every one of them was dressed in white. Not necessarily in the same exact outfit, but all of them wore pale, white clothing that caught the headlights. Some appeared to be in long dresses or robes. Some looked like they had white shirts or coats on. From the car, in the dark, I could not see enough detail to know exactly what they were wearing. But they were definitely not dressed normally for standing outside on a cold fall night. They were grouped together in a large circle, not too close to the road, but close enough that I could see them clearly as we passed. For 1 second, I had no idea what I was looking at. My mind tried to make it ordinary. Maybe there was a party. Maybe it was some kind of outdoor event. Maybe they were doing a photo shoot. Maybe it was a play, a costume gathering, a wedding-related thing, or some strange neighborhood tradition I knew nothing about. But even as I tried to think of normal explanations, something about the scene felt wrong. It was late. The road was empty. The house was dark, except for a few lights farther back near the building. The people were standing in a perfect or nearly perfect circle on the lawn, and none of them seemed to be talking. At least, I could not hear anyone talking. The car windows were closed, and we were moving, so maybe there was sound I simply could not make out. But from inside the car, the group looked completely silent. They seemed to be focused on something in the center of the circle. I could not see what it was. Maybe there was nothing there. Maybe they were facing inward, doing some kind of group activity. Maybe they were praying. Maybe they were holding hands. Maybe they were talking quietly. I do not know. What I remember most clearly is that they were all facing toward the middle when I first saw them. Then my car approached, and every one of them stopped. At the same time, they turned toward the road. They turned toward us. It did not happen one by one. It was not like one person looked up, then another, then another. It seemed like the entire group suddenly became aware of the car at once. Every white shape in that circle shifted in my direction. Every face turned toward the headlights. I felt my stomach drop. The people in the car went quiet. I do not remember who spoke first, but someone said something like, "What the hell is that?" Another person may have asked if I saw them too. I did. We all did. That was the worst part. If I had been alone, I could have told myself I was tired. I could have told myself the headlights had hit a group of statues, decorations, or sheets hanging in the yard. I could have blamed the dark, the trees, my own imagination, anything. But other people in the car saw the same thing. They saw the people. They saw the white clothes. They saw them standing in a circle, and they saw all of them turn toward us. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter. I did not slow down to get a better look. I did not pull over. I did not ask anyone if they wanted to stop. Every instinct I had told me to keep moving. I drove off. I did not speed recklessly, but I got away from that house as quickly as I could. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but I was aware of everyone in the car looking back through windows, trying to see what was happening behind us. I did not look in the rearview mirror right away. I did not want to. I had this horrible feeling that the people would still be standing there, watching the car disappear down the road. Or worse, that someone would be walking toward the road. Or that the entire group would somehow be gone when I looked back. Eventually, I did glance in the mirror. By then, the house was too far behind us to see clearly. The headlights no longer reached the lawn. The road had curved away. Everything behind us had gone back to darkness. For a few minutes, nobody said much. Then everyone started talking at once. What were they doing? Why were they all wearing white? Did you see them turn around? Were they looking at us? Was that some kind of cult thing? The word cult came up almost immediately. It is the kind of word people use when they see a group of strangers doing something unfamiliar in the dark. A circle of people dressed in white on the lawn of an old house looks like something from a horror movie, even if it could have been completely harmless. But at the time, It did not feel harmless. It felt secret. It felt like we had accidentally driven past something we were not meant to see. There was no obvious sign out front, no cars lining the road, no music, no party lights, no laughing people walking in and out of the house, no indication that it was a normal social event. Just a quiet, dark lawn. A circle, 15 or 20 people in white, and all of them turning toward us the second our car reached the property. I remember asking whether we should turn around. Someone said no immediately. Another person may have laughed nervously and said that we should keep going. Nobody wanted to go back. That was the strange part. We were curious. Of course we were. We wanted to know what we had seen. But curiosity was not stronger than the feeling in the car at that moment. We had all felt it. We had seen something that might have had an ordinary explanation, but none of us wanted to be the person who got out of the car and asked. There are times when a scene feels wrong in a way you cannot explain. You can look at each individual detail and find a reasonable answer. A group can gather outside. People can wear white. Someone can hold an event on their lawn. They can turn toward a passing car because the headlights catch their attention. Nothing about that is impossible. But when all the details happen together, in the dark, on an empty road, near a large old house, the feeling becomes something else. It becomes a moment that stays with you. We kept driving. Eventually, we reached a busier road, and the normal world came back. There were more streetlights. There were stores or houses with lights on. Other cars passed us. We could see normal people going about their normal lives, but nobody in the car had really moved on from what we saw. We kept bringing it up. Someone said maybe it was a church group. Someone else said it could have been some kind of ritual. Someone wondered whether they were filming something. Another person said maybe they were doing some old-fashioned play or reenactment. Every explanation sounded strange because the gathering itself had been strange. I tried to think about the house. I had passed it before. I knew the road. I knew the large houses had been there for years. But I did not know who lived in that one. I did not know whether it was privately owned, used for events, rented out, or connected to any local group. It was just one of the houses you noticed while driving by. After that night, it became the house with the circle. For a while, I avoided that road at night. I did not make a huge effort to stay away from it, but if I had another route, I would usually take it. I did not want to pass the house again and see the same group standing there. During the day, the road seemed ordinary. The lawns looked normal. The old houses looked historic or beautiful rather than threatening. The trees looked like trees. I might drive past that particular house and see nothing unusual at all. Maybe someone mowing the lawn, a car in the driveway, curtains in the windows, the normal signs of people living there. But after dark, I would think about that night. I would picture the headlights moving across the lawn. I would picture those white figures in a circle, and I would remember the exact moment they all turned. I never found out what was happening. I never asked the people who lived there. I never saw an article about a ceremony, party, gathering, or event at that house. I never heard anyone else mention a group dressed in white on that road. Maybe it was a private event. Maybe it was a harmless ritual, religious gathering, themed party, community activity, or some kind of ceremony that only looked frightening because we passed it at the worst possible time. Maybe there was a legitimate reason for the white clothing. Maybe they were attending a memorial. Maybe they were rehearsing something. Maybe they were part of a spiritual group that met outside. Maybe it was a wedding tradition or a candlelight event, though I do not remember seeing candles. Maybe they had only turned because a car's headlights suddenly lit up the lawn. That is the most reasonable explanation. People look toward approaching headlights. A group standing together will often react as a group when something interrupts them. And when you are driving in the dark, your mind can make quiet people look more intense than they really are. I understand all of that. But I still remember the silence. I remember the way none of them seemed surprised, just suddenly still. I remember the way the whole circle turned toward us. There is a difference between people noticing a car and people seeming to stop what they are doing at the exact same moment. Maybe I am remembering it more dramatically now. 15 years is a long time. Memory changes. A strange moment can become sharper in some places and blurrier in others. The number of people could have been smaller than I remember. Maybe there were only 10. Maybe the circle was not perfect. Maybe the clothing was not all white, but looked white in the headlights. That is possible. But the basic image has never changed. A large lawn, an old house, a dark fall night, a group of people in pale clothes standing in a circle, then all of them turning to look at us. The other people in the car remember it too. We have talked about it since then, and even though each person remembers different little details, we agree on the main thing. There were people in white. They were gathered in a circle. They stopped and looked at the car. That is enough to make it more than just a strange glimpse from the corner of my eye. I was not alone. None of us were. That does not mean it was supernatural. I do not know what it was. It may have been completely normal to the people standing on that lawn. They may have seen us drive by, watched us speed away, and laughed about how weird we looked staring at them. Maybe we were the strange ones. Maybe we interrupted a harmless gathering and made it feel sinister because we saw only 10 seconds of it through headlights on a dark road. But even with that possibility, I would not have stopped. Not then. Not with everyone standing so still. Not with every face turned toward the car. I just kept driving. And every now and then, when I am out late on a quiet road in the fall, I think about that house. I think about how dark the road was. I think about the old trees overhanging the pavement. I think about my headlights sweeping across the lawn and revealing a circle of silent people dressed in white. Then I remember the feeling in my chest when they all turned at once. And I remember exactly why I noped out and drove away. Tonight's stories are over, but darkness has a way of making memories feel closer. Some people never forgot what they saw. Others never learned what was behind the sound, the voice, or the shape waiting just outside the light. Tell me in the comments which story you will be thinking about after this ends. Subscribe to Wickless Night for more true accounts from the hours when no one wants to be awake alone. Sleep carefully, and do not trust every shadow that stays still.